What's up, history buffs? Today we're diving into the question nobody dares to ask. Richard III, the real monster behind Shakespeare's myth. Forget everything you think you know, because the real story behind this guy is way more twisted than any Netflix series you've binged. Smash that like button if you want the raw, unfiltered truth, and let me know in the comments how far you think political spin can actually twist history. Here's the deal, folks. For over 500 years, Richard III has been history's ultimate bad guy. Hunchbacked villain, child murderer. The king so evil that Shakespeare turned him into a comic book supervillain who literally talks to the audience about how much he loves being wicked. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about this guy is basically propaganda? Picture this. It's 1485. You've just won a battle that made you King of England. Your enemy is dead on the battlefield, crown literally knocked off his head. But here's the problem. That dead guy, he was actually a pretty decent king. His people liked him. So how do you justify taking his throne? Simple. You turn him into a monster. Real talk, this next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. The hunchbacked, child-killing tyrant version of Richard III that we all know, that's not history. That's the medieval equivalent of a hit piece, and it worked so well that we're still believing it 500 years later. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think it's possible to completely rewrite someone's reputation after they're dead. Because guys, we're about to dive into one of history's most successful character assassinations, and trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about good guys and bad guys in history. But here's where things get really wild. In 2012, archaeologists found Richard III's actual body in a parking lot in Leicester, England. And guess what they discovered? The real Richard III tells a completely different story than the Shakespeare version. Buckle up, because this story is about to completely blow your mind. All right, everyone, let's start with what we actually know versus what we've been told. August 2012. A team of archaeologists starts digging up a parking lot behind a social services building in Leicester. They're looking for a lost medieval church, maybe some old foundations. Instead, they find a skeleton with a metal arrowhead lodged in the spine and severe scoliosis. Plot twist incoming. This isn't just any skeleton. DNA testing confirms it. This is Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England. The guy who died at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, fighting to keep his crown. And here's the kicker. The bones tell us way more truth than any Tudor historian ever did. First major revelation, Richard III did have a spinal condition, but he wasn't the grotesque hunchback that Shakespeare described. The scoliosis would have made one shoulder slightly higher than the other, maybe caused him some back pain, but this dude was a warrior king who died in battle wearing full armor. You don't charge into combat on horseback if you're some twisted weakling monster. But here's what really gets me fired up about this discovery. For centuries, historians had been debating whether Richard was really buried in Leicester, whether the stories about his body being thrown in a river were true, whether he even had a physical deformity at all. And boom, science settles it in one parking lot excavation. The bones show us a man who lived hard and died violently. Multiple battle wounds, evidence of a warrior's life. This wasn't some scheming villain hiding in castle shadows plotting murder. This was a medieval king doing what medieval kings did, fighting for power in an age when might literally made right. Real talk. If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most insane plot twist in medieval politics. Because now we need to ask the big question. If the real Richard III wasn't the monster from the play, then who was he really? And why did someone go to such incredible lengths to destroy his reputation? Pause the video right now and guess what happens next. Because we're about to meet the guy who had every reason to turn Richard III into history's greatest villain. Listen up, because I'm about to tell you a story so crazy that if it was fiction, you'd say it was too unrealistic. Meet Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, the guy who killed Richard III, and then spent the rest of his life convincing everyone that Richard deserved to die. Here's the thing about Henry Tudor that nobody talks about in school. This dude had practically no legitimate claim to the English throne. Like seriously, his claim was so weak it was basically non-existent. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was descended from an illegitimate son of John of Gaunt. and even that line had been specifically barred from the throne by Parliament. Meanwhile, Richard III, he was the brother of the previous king, Edward IV, chosen by Parliament as the rightful heir. So how does a guy with no real claim to the throne convince an entire nation that he's the good guy and the actual king is evil incarnate? Welcome to Medieval Politics 101, folks. You write the history books after you win the war. But here's where things get really wild. Henry Tudor wasn't even English in any meaningful sense. He'd been living in exile in France since he was 14 years old. This guy spent more of his life speaking French than English, was funded by foreign enemies of England, and invaded with a mercenary army that included French soldiers and Welsh rebels. In modern terms, he was basically a foreign-backed insurgent trying to overthrow the legitimate government. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into pure propaganda genius. Henry Tudor understood something that Richard III apparently didn't. In politics, the story matters more than the truth. Richard spent his time actually governing England, making legal reforms, protecting the rights of common people, establishing the presumption of innocence in court proceedings. Boring stuff. Effective stuff, but boring. Henry Tudor? He hired the best writers money could buy and started crafting the narrative that would justify his coup. Step 1. Turn Richard III into such a monster that killing him becomes a heroic act. Step 2. Spread that story until it becomes accepted history. Hold up. Before we dive deeper into this medieval propaganda machine, let me know in the comments if you think this sounds familiar. Because guys, what Henry Tudor did to Richard III 500 years ago, we're still seeing the exact same playbook used in politics today. Buckle up, Buttercup, because we're about to dive into how to destroy someone's reputation so thoroughly that people are still believing your lies 5 centuries later. Henry Tudor didn't just win a battle, he won the information war. And he did it so effectively that it makes modern spin doctors look like amateurs. First, let's talk about the immediate aftermath of Bosworth Field. Richard III dies fighting, literally to the last breath, refusing to flee when his army starts collapsing around him. Contemporary accounts, the ones written before Tudor propaganda took over, describe him as fighting bravely, taking on multiple opponents, nearly reaching Henry Tudor himself before being overwhelmed. But here's how Henry Tudor spun it. Richard III was a coward who died trying to flee the battlefield. His body was stripped naked, thrown over a horse like a sack of grain, and paraded through the streets of Leicester before being dumped in an unmarked grave. This wasn't just defeating an enemy. This was ritual humiliation designed to send a message. Now comes the really diabolical part. Henry Tudor couldn't just rely on military victory. He needed legal justification for taking the throne. So his first parliament passed the Titulus Regius Repeal Act. Sounds boring, right? Wrong. This act declared that Richard III had never been the legitimate king at all, which meant that everything Richard had done as king was automatically invalid. But plot twist, they didn't just repeal the act, they ordered every single copy destroyed. That's right, folks. Henry Tudor literally tried to erase the legal document that explained Richard III's claim to the throne from existence. It's like deleting someone's Wikipedia page and all the sources, except with the power of medieval government behind it. Real talk. This is where things get absolutely bonkers. Henry Tudor was so paranoid about Richard III's reputation that he banned people from even owning copies of the document that justified Richard's kingship. Possession of a copy became treason. Imagine being so insecure about your own legitimacy that you make it illegal for people to read your predecessor's resume. And this is just the beginning of the Tudor propaganda campaign. We haven't even gotten to the part where they start inventing murders yet. If you think modern political mudslinging is bad, wait until you see what these guys did with quill pens and parchment. All right, everyone, gather round because we're about to tackle the big one. The accusation that made Richard III history's ultimate villain. The princes in the tower. This is the story that everyone knows. Richard III murdered his own nephews, 2 innocent children, to secure his throne. It's the crime that Shakespeare built his entire play around. The reason Richard III became synonymous with child-killing evil. Here's the problem, guys. There's literally no evidence that Richard III killed anyone. None. Zero. Zilch. And I'm about to blow your mind with how flimsy this entire accusation actually is. Let's start with the basic facts. Edward IV dies in 1483, leaving behind two sons, 12-year-old Edward V and 9-year-old Richard of York. As their uncle and the brother of the dead king, Richard III becomes their protector until Edward V comes of age. Standard medieval procedure. But then Richard III declares the boys illegitimate, based on evidence that their father, Edward IV, had been secretly married to another woman before he married their mother. This makes Richard III the rightful heir instead of the boys. Parliament agrees and crowns Richard king. Now here's where the Tudor spin machine kicks into overdrive. The boys disappear from the Tower of London sometime during 1483. Nobody knows what happened to them. They just vanish. No bodies, no witnesses, no evidence of murder at all. But Henry Tudor's propagandists turned this mystery into Richard III's greatest crime. They claimed, with absolutely no proof, that Richard had the boys murdered to eliminate them as rivals. They painted vivid pictures of innocent children being smothered in their sleep by Richard's agents. Hold up. Let me ask you something. If you were going to murder two kids to steal a throne, would you do it in the most public prison in your kingdom, where everyone would notice they'd disappeared? Or would you maybe, I don't know, have them quietly killed somewhere else and claim they'd died of illness? The entire accusation makes no strategic sense. Richard III had already legally delegitimized the boys' claim to the throne. Parliament had confirmed his right to rule. Killing them would have been politically stupid and personally dangerous. It would have turned them from illegitimate bastards into martyrs. Plot twist incoming. There were plenty of other people who had much better motives for wanting those boys dead, including, I don't know, the guy who eventually became king and really needed Richard III to look like a monster to justify his own coup. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. What if the guy who spent decades accusing Richard III of murdering the princes was actually the one who had them killed? What if the entire Richard III murdered his nephews story was just psychological projection on a massive scale? Let's think about this logically, folks. Who actually benefited from the prince's death? Richard III had already neutralized them politically by declaring them illegitimate. Alive or dead, they weren't a threat to his throne as long as Parliament supported his claim. But Henry Tudor? Those boys were a massive problem for him. Here's why. Even if Henry Tudor defeated Richard III in battle, those princes still had a better claim to the throne than he did. Edward V and Richard of York were the sons of a king. Henry Tudor was a foreign-backed rebel with a questionable pedigree. As long as those boys were alive, they represented a legitimate alternative to Tudor rule. But here's where things get really wild. After Henry Tudor became king, he could have produced the princes to prove Richard III hadn't killed them. Imagine the propaganda victory. Look, Richard III was such a terrible king he couldn't even murder children properly. But instead, Henry Tudor never mentions the princes again. They just disappear from Tudor history. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into conspiracy territory. Some historians now think Henry Tudor had the princes killed after he became king, then blamed their murders on Richard III retroactively. It's the perfect crime. Kill your rivals, blame your dead enemy, become the hero who avenged innocent children. Think about the timeline here, guys. The princes disappear sometime in 1483. Richard III rules for 2 years without anyone accusing him of murder. It's only after Henry Tudor takes power that the Richard III killed the princes story starts spreading. Convenient timing, right? But wait, there's more. In 1674, workmen found 2 small skeletons buried under a staircase in the Tower of London. Everyone assumed these were the murdered princes. But when scientists examined the bones in 1933, they couldn't even determine the sex of the skeletons, let alone prove they were the princes or establish when they died. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think it's possible that history's greatest child murder accusation might actually be history's greatest cover-up, because we're about to dive into how this lie became so embedded in English culture that it survived for 500 years. Buckle up, because we're about to meet the man who turned Tudor propaganda into immortal art. William Shakespeare, the greatest writer in English history, and the guy who accidentally became Richard III's most effective character assassin. Here's the thing about Shakespeare that blows my mind. He wasn't trying to write history. He was trying to write entertainment for Elizabethan audiences who wanted to see their queen's grandfather, Henry VII, portrayed as the hero who saved England from a monster. Shakespeare was basically writing the medieval equivalent of a Marvel movie. Good guys, bad guys, and a villain so over-the-top evil that the audience would cheer when he died. But plot twist, Shakespeare's Richard III was so brilliantly written, so charismatically evil, so quotably villainous, that people started treating the play like a historical document. Now, as the winter of our discontent became more famous than anything the real Richard III ever said. The hunchbacked, child-murdering villain became more real to people than the actual king. And this is where things get absolutely wild, folks. Shakespeare didn't even pretend to be writing accurate history. He compressed events, invented conversations, created composite characters, and turned complex political situations into simple moral tales. Richard III in the play is literally a pantomime villain who tells the audience about his evil plans. No real person talks like that. But here's what Shakespeare did that the Tudor propagandists couldn't. He made Richard III entertaining. Boring history books are easy to ignore. A brilliant play that gets performed over and over for centuries, that shapes culture. That becomes common knowledge that people accept without questioning. Real talk. If you're still with me, you're about to witness how one playwright's artistic choices echoed through history for 400 years. Because Shakespeare didn't just write a play about Richard III, he created the version of Richard III that most people still believe in today. Think about this. How many people have read actual medieval chronicles about Richard III's reign? Maybe a few hundred historians. How many people have seen Shakespeare's play or movies based on it? Millions, tens of millions. When popular culture tells the same story for centuries, that story becomes truth in the public mind. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into modern media criticism. Because what Shakespeare did to Richard III in 1592, we're still seeing happen today. When entertainment becomes more influential than journalism, when fictional narratives shape public opinion more than documented facts, when people prefer dramatic stories to complicated truths. Hold up. Before we dive deeper into this, let me know in the comments if you can think of other historical figures who've been defined more by their fictional portrayals than by actual history. Because guys, Richard III might be the most extreme example, but he's definitely not the only one. Listen up, because I'm about to tell you what actually happened when you strip away 500 years of propaganda and get to the historical facts. Spoiler alert. The real Richard III was probably the most competent king England had in decades, and his biggest crime was being on the losing side of a civil war. Let's start with what Richard III actually accomplished in his 2-year reign. This guy established the presumption of innocence in English law. You know, that radical idea that people should be considered innocent until proven guilty? That was Richard III. He created the first laws protecting buyers from fraud, reformed the legal system to help poor people get justice, and established a postal system that actually worked. But here's where things get really wild. Richard III was actually popular with his people. Contemporary records show that the citizens of London supported him, Northern England loved him, and his policies were designed to help common people rather than just nobles. This wasn't some hated tyrant clinging to power through fear. This was a king who governed effectively and tried to reform the system. Plot twist incoming, almost everything we think we know about Richard III being evil comes from sources written after Henry Tudor took power. The contemporary accounts, the ones written while Richard was actually alive and ruling, paint a completely different picture. They describe a capable administrator, a brave warrior, and a king who cared about justice. Even the physical descriptions of Richard III were retroactively changed by Tudor historians. Contemporary accounts describe him as a normal-looking man of average height. The withered arm and hunched back don't appear in any source until after 1485. It's like watching someone's dating profile get edited by their ex after a bad breakup. And here's the smoking gun that proves how extensive the Tudor revision was. They didn't just change Richard III's reputation, they changed the reputations of everyone associated with him. His supporters became traitors, his policies became tyrannical, his victories became defeats. It's historical revisionism on a scale that would make Orwell's Ministry of Truth proud. Real talk. This is where things get absolutely bonkers. The Tudor propaganda campaign was so successful that it survived the end of the Tudor dynasty, the English Civil War, the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution, and made it all the way to the 20th century, essentially unchanged. That's not just effective spin. That's complete information warfare victory. But here's what really gets me fired up about this whole story, guys. In 1924, a group called the Richard III Society was formed to research the real history and clear Richard's name. They spent decades collecting evidence, analyzing documents, challenging the traditional narrative. And guess what they found? Pretty much everything we've been told about Richard III being evil was unsupported by contemporary evidence. All right, everyone, gather round because we're about to see how modern forensic science finally started giving Richard III the fair trial he never got in life. Remember that parking lot discovery I mentioned at the beginning? That was just the start of Richard III's historical rehabilitation. The 2012 discovery of Richard's remains didn't just confirm he existed, it started dismantling centuries of lies piece by piece. The bones showed evidence of multiple battle wounds, proving he died fighting bravely rather than fleeing like a coward. The scoliosis was real, but not severe enough to cause the dramatic deformity described by Shakespeare. This was a warrior king, not a twisted villain. But here's where things get really wild. The scientific analysis of the remains revealed something even more important. Richard III had been buried with respect and ceremony, not thrown in an unmarked grave like Tudor sources claimed. Someone had taken the time to properly prepare his body and bury him in a church, which suggests he wasn't universally hated even immediately after his death. Meanwhile, historians started going back to original sources with fresh eyes. And guess what they found? Document after document showing that Richard III's reign was actually pretty successful. He reformed the legal system, improved trade, strengthened England's borders, and governed with unusual attention to the rights of common people. Plot twist incoming, even Richard III's supposed usurpation of the throne starts looking legitimate when you examine the evidence carefully. The claim that his nephews were illegitimate wasn't something Richard just made up for convenience. There's substantial evidence that Edward IV really had been secretly married to Eleanor Butler before his public marriage, which would indeed have made his later children bastards under medieval law. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into legal history. Parliament didn't just rubber stamp Richard's claim. They investigated it, debated it, and concluded based on evidence that he was the rightful heir. This wasn't a coup. It was a legal succession according to the laws and customs of the time. Real talk. If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most insane reversal in historical reputation ever recorded. Because in the last 50 years, serious historians have essentially concluded that almost everything we thought we knew about Richard III was wrong. The Richard III Society, academic historians, forensic scientists, and legal scholars have all reached the same conclusion. Richard III was probably one of the better medieval kings, certainly not the monster of legend, and quite possibly the victim of one of history's most successful smear campaigns. But here's what really blows my mind about this whole story, guys. It took over 500 years. The invention of DNA testing, ground-penetrating radar, forensic osteology, and the dedication of amateur historians to finally start setting the record straight. That's how thoroughly Henry Tudor's propaganda machine did its job. Buckle up, Buttercup, because we're about to answer the question posed in our title. Who was the real monster, Richard III, or the system that destroyed his reputation? Here's the thing that's been driving me crazy throughout this entire story. We've been asking the wrong question for 500 years. Everyone wants to know whether Richard III murdered the princes. But the real question is, why did Henry Tudor need Richard III to be a monster so badly that he was willing to rewrite history to make it happen? The answer is simple and terrifying, because Henry Tudor's claim to the English throne was so weak that he couldn't justify it any other way. He couldn't claim to be the rightful heir. Richard III had a better bloodline. He couldn't claim to be chosen by God. Richard III had been crowned and anointed. He couldn't claim popular support. Richard III was actually liked by his people, so Henry Tudor did the only thing left available to him. He made himself the hero of a story where Richard III was the villain. And this is where things get absolutely wild. Henry Tudor essentially invented modern political spin 500 years before the term existed. But here's where our story takes a hard left turn into something much darker. Henry Tudor didn't just defeat Richard III, he erased him. Not just from life, but from history, from memory, from the very possibility of fair judgment by future generations. That's not just winning a war. That's destroying someone so completely that truth itself becomes irrelevant. Think about this, folks. Richard III ruled for 2 years. Henry Tudor ruled for 24 years. In those 24 years, Henry had every opportunity to reveal evidence of Richard's crimes, to produce witnesses, to document his predecessor's evil. Instead, he spent those years destroying evidence that might contradict his narrative and commissioning historians to write increasingly elaborate stories about Richard's villainy. Real talk, this is where things get absolutely bonkers. The more you study Henry Tudor's reign, the more you realize that everything he accused Richard III of doing, murdering rivals, ruling through fear, eliminating inconvenient claimants to the throne, Henry Tudor actually did. We're looking at a classic case of psychological projection on a historical scale. Henry Tudor executed anyone with a plausible claim to the throne, including elderly Margaret Pole, who was literally dragged to the execution block at age 67. He created a climate of paranoia and suspicion that lasted throughout the Tudor dynasty. He ruled through informants, show trials, and the constant threat of treason charges. But here's the genius part. By making Richard III the ultimate villain of English history, Henry Tudor made himself and his descendants the heroes by comparison. No matter how brutal Tudor rule became, people could always say, well, at least we're not being ruled by another Richard III. Hold up. Before we get to the final revelation, let me know in the comments if you're starting to see parallels between what happened to Richard III and modern political character assassination. Because, guys, we're about to discover that this 500-year-old propaganda campaign is still affecting how we think about power and legitimacy today. Listen up, because I'm about to explain why this 500-year-old story should terrify anyone who cares about truth, justice, or historical accuracy. The destruction of Richard III's reputation wasn't just medieval politics. It was a blueprint for how to completely rewrite reality when you have enough power and patience. Here's what Henry Tudor figured out that makes this story relevant today. If you control the narrative long enough, the narrative becomes the truth. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It doesn't matter what the evidence shows. If your story gets repeated enough times by enough trusted sources, it becomes historical fact. And this is where things get really wild. The techniques Henry Tudor used 500 years ago are still being used today. Destroy inconvenient evidence? Check. Commission friendly historians to write official accounts? Check. Repeat your version of events until it becomes accepted wisdom? Check. Make questioning the official story seem disloyal or crazy? Check. Plot twist incoming. We're still living with the consequences of Henry Tudor's propaganda campaign. The idea that Richard III was evil incarnate became so embedded in English culture that it shaped how people thought about legitimate authority, political power, and moral leadership for centuries. Think about this. For 500 years, English speakers have been taught that Richard III represents ultimate political evil. But what if that lesson was based on a lie? What if the real lesson should be about how easily truth can be manipulated by those in power? Real talk. This is where things get absolutely bonkers. The Richard III story shows us how quickly historical facts can be manufactured when the people in charge have sufficient motivation and resources. And once those manufactured facts get embedded in popular culture through entertainment, They become almost impossible to dislodge. But here's what really keeps me up at night about this story, guys. If Henry Tudor could completely rewrite the reputation of a king who ruled for 2 years and had thousands of contemporary witnesses to his actual character, what's stopping modern power brokers from doing the same thing to people today? We live in an age of information warfare where narratives can be crafted and distributed globally in real time. If a medieval king with quill pens and parchment could fool the world for 500 years, what could modern propagandists accomplish with television, internet, and social media? And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into media literacy. Because the real monster in the Richard III story isn't any individual person. It's the system that allowed lies to triumph over truth for 5 centuries. It's the willingness of people to accept dramatic stories over documented facts. It's the power of entertainment to shape historical memory. Hold up. Before we get to the final revelation, I want you to think about this. How many other historical villains might actually have been victims of successful character assassination? How many heroes might actually have been monsters whose reputations were protected by effective spin? If we got Richard III this wrong for this long, what else might we be wrong about? All right, everyone, we've reached the end of our journey, and it's time to answer the question we started with. Richard III, the real monster behind Shakespeare's myth. Spoiler alert, the real monster was never Richard III at all. The real monster was the system that allowed political convenience to override historical truth for 500 years. The real monster was the willingness of generations to accept a dramatic narrative over documented evidence. The real monster was the power structure that could literally erase a person's reputation from history and replace it with a fabrication. Here's what we've learned, folks. Richard III was probably a decent medieval king who got caught on the wrong side of a civil war and paid the ultimate price, not just his life, but his historical reputation. He was politically outmaneuvered by Henry Tudor, who understood that winning battles wasn't enough. You had to win the information war too. But here's where things get really wild. In trying to destroy Richard III's reputation, Henry Tudor actually revealed something much more terrifying about the nature of power itself. He showed that with sufficient resources, patience, and control over information, you can make people believe literally anything. You can turn heroes into villains, victims into monsters, lies into historical facts. The real Richard III, the one we can reconstruct from contemporary evidence, forensic analysis, and careful historical research, was a complex medieval ruler trying to govern effectively in a violent age. He reformed laws, protected common people's rights, and died fighting for his throne. Was he perfect? Of course not. Was he the monster of legend? Absolutely not. Real talk. This is where things get absolutely bonkers. We've spent 500 years hating the wrong person. Richard III wasn't the monster. He was the victim. The real monsters were the people who destroyed him posthumously and the system that allowed them to get away with it for centuries. But here's the most important lesson from this entire story. Truth has a way of eventually fighting back. It took 500 years, but Richard III is finally getting his reputation rehabilitated. Science triumphed over propaganda. Evidence defeated spin. Facts overcame fiction. What do you think, guys? Was Richard III a victim of history's greatest character assassination, or am I completely crazy for challenging 500 years of accepted history? Let me know in the comments, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more crazy stuff in medieval history that schools never teach you. And if this story blew your mind, smash that like button and subscribe for more videos that challenge everything you thought you knew about history. Because if we got Richard III this wrong for this long, imagine what other historical facts might actually be elaborate lies. The real monster behind Shakespeare's myth wasn't Richard III. It was the realization that history is written by the winners, and sometimes the winners are willing to lie for centuries to justify their victories. Sweet dreams, history buffs. Try not to think too hard about what other cherished beliefs might be built on quicksand.